and upsetting.
Tonight, are these the most serious accusations ever levelled against members of the British establishment?
I've never experienced pain like it. I hope I never do again. They had no fear at all of being caught.
The claim that politicians, military leaders and Secret Service chiefs got together to torture, rape and murder children.
I am a homosexual. I'm not a murderer. I'm not a paedophile or pederast.
30-year-old rumours of a VIP paedophile ring have been revived.
I recognised him instantly from the photograph, who he was. He was wearing only a frilly apron and cap with a naked boy on his lap.
Powerful people got away with abuse in the past, but has the pendulum swung too far?
There may be a danger. The police are now spending an undue amount of time investigating cases that have all the hallmarks of being fantasy.
How the vulnerable say they've been persuaded to name names.
I believe it's time that the truth came out. I feel guilty for names of people that I've never even said. If my name's been used or I've been the thing, then I'm sorry about that.
And we ask, what is the truth about Britain's VIP paedophile ring? For 30 years, the possibility of a paedophile ring within Britain's establishment remained the stuff of rumour. An elite group of men who use their power to abuse children. It was said to have happened at two key locations. One on the doorstep of Parliament, the exclusive apartment block where many MPs had a home, Dolphin Square. The other, a down-at-heel B&B along the river, Elm Guesthouse. The whispers are now the focus of ongoing police inquiries. One man says 3 children were murdered.
It's been a secret for far too long. It's not just me, there are others. Whether they have the ability to come forward, I don't know. I hope so.
His identity can't be revealed. Known only as Nick, he says he was abused for 9 years. At military bases, the Carlton Club, London townhouses and Dolphin Square.
It's one location that I was taken to. As a child, I was both physically and sexually abused by quite a number of different men, and some were very powerful people, and some were politicians.
A Prime Minister, a Home Secretary, a Chief of the Defence Staff, a General, heads of the security services and MPs. All accused of colluding in the most horrific sexual abuse and murder of children. For almost a year, Panorama has been investigating what lies behind these allegations. What's emerged are politicians using their influence to reach right into the justice system. Some journalists treating unsubstantiated allegations as fact. A police service that some say is now too willing to believe anything. All of them trying to make amends for the terrible mistakes of the past.
Scotland Yard says the late Sir Jimmy Savile was a predatory sex offender who carried out abuse over 4 decades.
Good evening. Welcome.
It's 3 years since Jimmy Savile was exposed as a paedophile. His celebrity had given him the power to abuse children. His crimes hidden in plain sight. Some of our most trusted institutions, the police, the NHS and the BBC, had failed in their duty of care.
Savile was a predatory sex offender. He has perpetrated 4 decades of abuse.
Peter Spindler led the police inquiry into abuse by celebrities.
The Savile investigation was a watershed moment for the investigation of non-recent abuse. I don't think anybody had anticipated the scale and nature of the allegations that were going to be made against him, against some of his colleagues, and against other powerful and important people.
For decades, some celebrities had got away with abusing children. But now the climate has changed. Rolf Harris, Max Clifford and Stuart Hall among those taken to court and jailed. Their victims at last believed.
There has been a move on the part of the authorities, and particularly the police now, to be far more receptive to these allegations and to not do as many used to do, which is to concentrate on looking at who is reporting the crime as opposed to the person who is being accused of the crime.
It was those attitudes which had stood in the way of victims getting justice. Ian McFadden was abused by teachers at his boarding school.
Basically, it stole my childhood. It created a demon. I was not the same person who I was before I was abused. I learned how to lie. I was taught by teachers how to lie, how to keep secrets. It's pretty devastating stuff when as a child, an adult seems to think that they have the right to lay their hands on you for their own sexual gratification. I've carried shadows and demons with me for over 30 years, and for 30 years, I never said anything.
When he did go to the police, it was 2 years before they took his allegations seriously. The head teacher who abused him was finally jailed.
You know, I have no joy sending old men to prison. I don't. But do you know what? When you do what these people did to me and others behind closed doors, then there has to be ramifications for them.
People will hide behind their status and their power and use it to either exploit the vulnerable or to convince others that they are beyond the law. And we have got to make amends for that, and we have got to show the victims that that won't be tolerated ever again.
MPs as well as the police had a chance to uncover past abuse. Labour's deputy leader Tom Watson had already exposed police failings over phone hacking.
We found News Corporation carried out an extensive cover-up of its rampant law-breaking.
Now he was onto something even more serious.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I want to ensure that the Metropolitan Police secure the evidence, re-examine it, and investigate clear intelligence suggesting a powerful paedophile network linked to Parliament and Number 10.
I think that was a turning point, and now people were realising that the type of abuse that we were talking about from the 60s and the 70s wasn't just being perpetrated within the world of the media and celebrity, but actually it might have involved other high-profile, prominent people, and it might not have been investigated properly at the time.
Tom Watson's allegations of a cover-up were taken seriously. Cyril Smith had escaped prosecution during his lifetime, protected by his status as a well-known politician. Another paedophile, a well-connected prep school teacher, was jailed for 13 years after Tom Watson's call for action.
It was only when Tom Watson started making a noise about it and putting pressure on the police, they then opened an inquiry and they tracked down everyone who had been at school with me and found that about a third of them had been sexually abused by this master. And so with dozens of witnesses, they finally prosecuted him.
In the wake of his claims of a paedophile ring linked to Downing Street, Tom Watson received dozens of tip-offs about where the police should look. He passed them on to the Met.
something like 220 lines of inquiry, and they were particularly focused in southwest London.
There was one name that kept coming up, a place long rumoured to have been at the heart of the VIP paedophile ring, Elm Guesthouse.
Well, this is it. It's just a normal house in a respectable area of southwest London. But when it was Elm Guesthouse, this was supposed to be one of the key locations in the VIP paedophile ring.
There were two main allegations: that boys had been trafficked to the guest house for sex, and that the clients had included politicians and other VIPs. Our investigations into Elm Guesthouse started here, a local archive. Newspapers reported that Elm Guesthouse had been run as a gay brothel. We spoke to a man who worked there briefly in the 80s. It's the first time he's spoken about it.
You worked initially there doing cleaning?
Just cleaning, yeah. Just cleaning around bathrooms, bedrooms. And after that, it just turned.
Into something else?
To a brothel. And I just needed the money to survive.
He was put to work in a sauna room on the top floor of the house.
What kind of sexual services were involved?
It was oral and hand relief.
The guest house was raided by the police and shut down in June 1982. The owners, Carol Kazir and her husband Harry, were given suspended sentences for running a disorderly house and having obscene videos. Elm Guesthouse had been advertised in a newsletter for the Conservative Group for Homosexual Equality. There were a few reports at the time that MPs had been there, but nothing came of them. Until a former social worker entered the story.
Hello, Chris. Hello. How are you? Yeah, not so bad, thanks. Yourself?
His name is Chris Fay. For years, he's been trying to get the rumours about Elm Guesthouse taken seriously.
That's very kind of you, yeah. I'll say yes, I've got a tea.
He says he met the owner, Carol Kazir, in 1989.
She was claiming that she'd been stitched up by the police. She told us that the whole thing had been organised by MI5 and Special Branch. It was to protect what she called people in high places who visited her guest house.
He says Carol Kazir showed him a guest book and he copied down the names. They were nicknames.
These are the names the VIPs used when they register in to stay at the Elm Guest House, and together with the nicknames that the victims had given them.
And you've got Leon Britton there.
Yeah, his nickname was Roger.
With Carol Kazir's help, Chris Fay turned those nicknames into a list of well-known people. That list, the Elm Guesthouse list, has become significant in the story of VIP abuse. Leon Britton is on it. So too are former MPs Cyril Smith and Harvey Proctor.
So Proctor booked in as Jensen, but he was known by the kids as Nutter.
And Chris Fay says Carol Kazir showed him photographs.
What did you see?
Well, she had a big cardboard box in there, and in that cardboard box were lots of files, papers, VHS cassettes, all sorts of stuff, including about 200 pictures, 200 photographs rather.
He says two of the photographs were of Leon Britton, who went on to become Home Secretary.
I recognised him instantly from the photograph, who he was. He was wearing only a frilly apron and cap with a naked boy on his lap. The second photo of Leon Britton, he was semi-naked with a very young boy on his lap who looked to me to be about 8 years old. And the boy was naked. When you saw stuff like that, it just made you angry because you understood why they wanted to cover this up and why they didn't want it coming out.
Chris Fay set about persuading people to believe his story, including the journalist John Oakes.
Well, obviously, as you would, I was very hopeful. I mean, it's like being told about the promised land. You know, you want to get there as soon as possible. You know, let's see the photographs, Chris. You know, where are they? Who has them? But he said that they'd been in Carol's possession and that following her demise, they couldn't be traced.
In 1990, Carol Kazir took her own life. At her inquest, Chris Fay named the VIPs he said had abused boys at Elm Guesthouse. It made the papers, although no names were published. John Oakes kept pursuing the story, but drew a blank.
I spent a lot of shoe leather. I mean, I rated myself as a reliable journalist. I think if there'd been anything solid there, that I would certainly have found it. I certainly tried hard enough, but there was no gold in the pan.
For decades, the allegations about Elm Guesthouse had died down. Then 3 years ago, Tom Watson, who'd reignited suggestions of a VIP paedophile ring, was put in touch with Chris Fay.
I got a phone call, so I went to see Tom Watson and told him basically what I've told you, what I know.
And what was his reaction?
He was appalled by it.
Soon after, the police turned up to talk to Chris Fay. He told them that boys had been trafficked to Elm Guesthouse for abuse from a nearby children's home.
How many children or former children who'd been taken to Elm Guesthouse and abused did you speak to?
22.
22?
Yeah.
How many of them implicated VIPs?
I would think most of them, probably 17, 18 of them, VIPs, yeah.
32 years ago, Mark was in care at the children's home. Chris Fay told us he was one of the boys that had been trafficked to Elm Guesthouse.
What did you tell Chris Fay?
At the times when Chris Fay came to my house, I was not there. I've never spoken to them.
Were you ever taken to Elm Guesthouse?
No.
And how can you be sure?
I don't recall it. I don't recall ever going to anywhere in southwest London of that sort. So unless I've completely blanked it from my memory, I have no recollection whatsoever.
The Met knew Chris Fay had been jailed over a shares fraud in 2011, but they listened to him and followed up his leads.
Monday morning, 9:30, 2 policemen knocked on my door and said, "We're from the Met Police, we'd like to talk to you about your experience in care 32 years ago."
The children's home, Grafton Close, is now a block of flats. The police traced many more former residents. They quickly discovered it was not at Elm Guesthouse where the boys had been sexually abused. It was at the children's home, by the home's manager and his friend.
What I experienced more of was grooming, which certainly took place and was taking place. Another boy and I were seen as being his favourites. We were both very small for our age, pretty boys.
The children's home manager died before he could be put on trial. His friend, a Catholic priest, was jailed for 3 years. His conviction was nothing to do with Elm Guesthouse. Mark is pleased that there's been justice for the Grafton Close residents, but the legal process has been difficult.
When the police come into your house and ask you questions, they take your box of horrible memories and open them on the floor in front of you, and they can't be put back in. The scaffolding that you've put around your life to keep you together has all been ripped down.
After the trial, Mark felt he was given little support.
If you're going to take somebody to that place of vulnerability, you need to wrap them in cotton wool. If you don't support victims and don't help them through that emotional turmoil, then you are, by default, supporting the abuser.
The rumours about Elm Guesthouse continue. The police now say they have a witness, a former male prostitute who claims Cyril Smith was a guest. The man we spoke to, who briefly worked there in the 1980s, doesn't recall any high-profile visitors.
Do you think it's possible that any of them might have been MPs or VIPs?
No.
What makes you say that?
Because they're on TV and that, you would have recognised them.
Do you think there could have been young children being abused there on a regular basis, as far as you were aware?
No, never. That never happened.
But there was evidence a boy who'd been living there had been abused. He was interviewed by the police after the raid that shut down the guest house. A social worker who sat with the child during the interview has recently told detectives that he heard the boy mention an Uncle Leon, but the police officer failed to record it. The officer insists it was never said. During months of research, we found no evidence of a VIP paedophile ring using Elm Guesthouse. Neither have we found any other evidence that the photographs Chris Fay told us about ever existed.
Officially, the police investigation continues, although Panorama understands that privately, detectives are conceding that it's running out of steam.
But despite that lack of police progress, the story of a VIP paedophile ring was about to get much, much bigger.
Good evening and welcome to the BBC News at 6. Detectives are investigating allegations that 3 young boys were murdered by a paedophile ring that included figures at the heart of the British establishment in the 1970s and 80s. The claims have been made by an alleged victim known only as Nick.
Nick described a childhood stolen by a group of men who raped and tortured him at smart London venues, including Dolphin Square. He said he watched them murder 3 boys. The story was broken by an investigative website called Exero. They'd been speaking to Nick for 5 months.
So Nick, just tell me a bit more about the nature of the politicians who sexually abused you and other boys at Dolphin Square.
Particularly nasty individuals. One was probably a lot worse than the other. One was a former cabinet minister, and the other was just a MP, but nasty, like to inflict pain, like to see us in pain.
Exero was launched 4 years ago. Its mission to investigate issues that are ignored by the mainstream media. It says it does reliable journalism, which holds power to account. Exero's editor-in-chief is Mark Watts.
While we don't have the powers that the police have, we're trusted.
Exaro News website was supposedly going to break lots of stories about political corruption and all sorts of things, and actually now it is entirely about VIP paedophiles and nothing else.
In the months ahead, there's going to be a lot more, even more shocking than we have exposed already.
Exero published its first story based on Nick in July last year. In it, he said he'd been abused at sex parties by powerful men who raped and beat him. Nick's allegations of murder hadn't yet been published, but the article caught the attention of the police.
The police contacted you, wanted to speak directly to myself.
What went through your mind in deciding what to do next?
Overcoming the fear, because of who the individuals are, deciding what I could and what I couldn't say, again because of who they were.
3 months after the story was published, Nick agreed to meet detectives. He'd spoken to police before. His story would evolve over time, which is not unusual in abuse cases. In 2012, he told Wiltshire police he'd been abused as a boy by his stepfather. There was no claim VIPs had been involved. His stepfather had died, so the police took it no further. And then Panorama came across what we think was his first appearance on TV. This time he'd been called Stephen.
My father started it, started being very violent. I don't really know how many months before others were involved.
It was a documentary about the Savile scandal. He told the programme he'd been passed onto a paedophile ring that included Jimmy Savile. Just like with his stepfather and later the MPs, he said extreme violence was involved.
Did Savile abuse you directly?
Yes. Yeah. He was just sadistic in what he wanted to do and what he wanted other people to do. Yeah, just evil, and enjoyed seeing pain inflicted and humiliation, I suppose.
Nick then wrote about his experiences online. He said the group were made up of influential people who believed they could get away with anything.
Detectives are now appealing for other victims to come forward. Here's our Home Affairs correspondent, Tom Simons.
Nick had also been talking to the BBC. He was the top item on the television news.
They had no fear at all of being caught. It didn't even cross their mind.
Nick has a professional background. His claims have convinced many.
I've had some communication with Nick. I have no issue with believing him. He sounds entirely credible to me. Why would somebody make any wild allegations, shall we say, about something so serious? Because if it was discovered that it was nothing but fantasy, then the police would quite rightly, and the CPS would quite rightly, throw the book at such people.
And the police decided to believe Nick too. A month after hearing Nick's story, the Met announced a triple murder inquiry called Operation Midland. And it came to a judgment that would define it from the start.
Nick has been interviewed over a long period of time by experienced detectives from the Child Abuse Command. And he has also met an investigator from the Murder Command. They and I believe what Nick to be saying is credible and true. So yes, we do believe what Nick is saying.
And that belief would be repeated in subsequent interviews.
I believe what Nick is saying is to be credible and to be true.
It was a radical departure from the past, when accounts from witnesses would be challenged from the start.
Victims have to have the confidence to come forward and approach us knowing that they will be believed, and their allegation, their report of abuse, will be dealt with in the appropriate manner.
The police hoped the approach would encourage more witnesses to come forward, as it had during the Operation U-Tree investigation into some celebrities.
Successful prosecutions in U-Tree and many of the other cases up and down the country have relied on completely unconnected victims coming forward in significant numbers and all saying the same thing about the perpetrator. And when you've got so many people saying the same thing and talking about it the same way, this is what's convincing juries to convict some of these prominent, high-profile individuals.
In the Jimmy Savile investigation, hundreds of witnesses came forward very quickly. Operation Midland has struggled to find any. Even so, the homes of 3 suspects were searched. Leon Britton, Lord Bramall, who was once head of the army, and the former MP, Harvey Proctor.
I gave an interview on the BBC Today programme. I have nothing to add to this Kafkaesque fantasy.
All 3 names quickly became public, connected to allegations the Met had described as credible and true.
This was a completely inappropriate statement for a police officer to make at a press conference to the nation at large. Well, it's absolutely critical when they're investigating cases of this sort that the police are completely fair and rigorously fair. While, of course, we all understand the difficulties for people who genuinely are victims of this sort of crime, the difficulties for people accused of this sort of crime are also stark. Massive publicity, horrible allegations, careers ruined, reputations trashed, and a lingering sense always in these cases that there's no smoke without fire.
It's always hard to prove an allegation that goes back years. For Operation Midland, investigating murder, there were no bodies and no specific crime scenes. But Nick had given some details about one of the murders. A hit and run, he said, in Kingston, southwest London.
This was the only murder that Nick claimed had happened in a public place. It meant that it was possible to check whether there was any report or record of an incident resembling the one he'd described.
Nick said he and a friend were walking to school sometime between May and July 1979. He said his friend was deliberately run down and killed by a car driven by one of the paedophile gang. Afterwards, Nick says he was bundled into the car and driven off. A warning to him, he mustn't make friends.
Nick told police he could only remember the boy's first name. Panorama has attempted to trace every boy with that name who was at school with Nick.
We can't be 100% sure, but we think we've found them all. None could be the victim of murder, and none of the former pupils we spoke to remember any boys being run over and killed. We found no reports of the accident in local newspapers.
Before Jimmy Savile, any apparently serious holes in a witness's account might have brought an end to a whole investigation. But since Savile, police have said they're prepared to give greater leeway to victims to get facts wrong about some individual incidents while still being believed in the round.
Do survivors ever get it wrong? Do survivors mess things up? Do they get confused? Do they sometimes tell their truth that is not perhaps entirely 100% accurate? Well, of course that can happen, because memory plays all sorts of tricks on you. And certainly as you get older, your memory fades and your memories can change. But the fundamental memory of whether or not something terrible happened to you isn't going to change.
9 months had passed since Operation Midland was launched. Harvey Proctor had been interviewed twice for several hours, and he'd had enough.
Anyone of a delicate or nervous disposition should leave the room now.
The world was about to learn exactly what Nick had accused him of doing.
Mr. Proctor then stripped the victim and tied him to a table. He then produced a large kitchen knife and stabbed the child through the arm and other parts of the body over a period of 40 minutes. Mr. Proctor untied the victim and anally raped him on the table. Mr. Proctor then strangled the victim until the boy's body went limp.
A violent, sadistic murder.
On another occasion at the same location, Mr. Proctor sexually assaulted Nick before producing a penknife and threatening to cut Nick's genitals.
There were some familiar names and places.
I was asked if I knew Jimmy Savile. I told them I did not. Nick alleges, surprise, surprise, that Savile attended the sex parties. I was asked if I visited Elm Guest House. I am sorry to have to disappoint the fantasists on the internet, but I did not visit Elm Guest House.
And there were some new names too. Maurice Oldfield, a former head of MI6, Michael Hanley, a former Director General of MI5, and former Prime Minister Sir Edward Heath.
I was asked if I could recognise images of the penknife mentioned earlier. It was suggested it was Edward Heath who persuaded me not to castrate Nick with it. It is so far-fetched as to be unbelievable. It is unbelievable because it is not true.
Harvey Proctor demanded the police shut down Operation Midland. The Met says it's carrying on, but admits it wasn't helpful to call Nick's allegations credible and true.
These allegations really tarnish people's reputations. And I think sometimes, just on occasions, that maybe everything that's being said is believed because police are frightened. You're damned if you do and damned if you don't. We've gone too far. The pendulum has swung too far. A strong investigator needs to make sure the evidence that is being received is credible and can be investigated thoroughly.
Pressure on the police was building, and Exaro was claiming to have another victim of abuse at Dolphin Square. They called him Darren.
I would be forced to attend parties where I'd be abused by men.
He says his abuse happened 10 years after Nick's, but other details were similar.
Without going into names, tell me a bit about who sexually abused you at Dolphin Square.
There was a cabinet minister specifically who abused me at Dolphin Square. He would like boys to wear women's underwear, specifically knickers.
That's next on 60 Minutes.
Exaro were heavily involved in a documentary for Australian television. Darren was a key part of it.
We would be basically told who to go and talk to and what to do and with which person.
The details were lurid and once again focused on Leon Britton.
One of the most powerful men in the land, Leon Britton, should have been prosecuting paedophiles. Instead, according to Darren and other witnesses, he was one of them.
He liked boys to dress in women's underwear and then to be in a room alone and discover you in women's underwear and punish you.
A member of Margaret Thatcher's cabinet?
Yes.
Raping children?
Yes.
But is it fair to Darren to rely so heavily on him? His past has not been easy. He was convicted in the 1990s of making bomb hoaxes, and he's also falsely confessed to murder and rape. 2 years ago, he sent an email to a social worker saying, "Leon Britton never abused me or anyone I know." So why name the poor man?
We think Exaro were aware of Darren's background. We asked if they knew about the email. They didn't respond, but told us their stories are always based on evidence. Darren's interview remains on their website. We wrote to Channel 9 in Australia. They didn't respond. I didn't meet Darren, but I'm on my way to see another man who's been talking to Exaro and says he suffered abuse over many years. We're calling him David.
I became just nothing. I became abused. I became just cheap. Cheap. Sex is cheap, like just slagging me off, just like selling me to the highest bidder. I was more vulnerable then than I was today because I couldn't read properly or write.
David started making claims about VIP paedophile abuse in 1990. He'd met Chris Fay at a support group, and he says he was encouraged to name names.
I don't know how Chris got me into saying names. It was done over a period of weeks, you know. It was like done as a joke, suggestion to start with, but that suggestion became reality.
David told me he'd described a distinctive birthmark on one of his abusers.
I scribed a birthmark and a first name and scribed the person, and they said the surname and everything, and says that can only be him. Why should I doubt them?
The man who ended up being named was Leon Britton.
I believed it because I believed that. I don't know, just believed it. I couldn't say why I believed it. I believed it at the time.
It was 25 years since David had had those conversations. He'd been trying to put his past behind him.
I was doing okay, you know. I weren't doing brilliant, but I was doing okay. And then I was starting to build my life back with my family and everything, and it took years and years and years to do that.
Then 2 years ago, according to David, Chris Fay got back in touch. VIP abuse was in the news again.
He was phoning up every single day. He was phoning up virtually every day, phoning me up like he's talking like he's your best friend, and do everything through me, Chris said. Do everything through me because you can trust me from 1990.
David says Chris Fay wanted him to meet journalists from Exero. They were interested in Dolphin Square, a place he'd first mentioned 2 decades ago.
The conversations we had with Chris Fay on the phone and everything, like stuff like they just wanted to know about Dolphin Square because you'd said it to us, so it's got to be true, and other people had said the same thing.
David says he's provided information for a number of Exero articles.
They'd used all sorts of bits of stuff. I'd said a lot of truths and everything, and when they looked at the truths I'd told them, they matched and everything. Obviously there was stuff, odd little bits of stuff which I wasn't sure about.
And then David said something extraordinary. He told me he'd called the police, saying he was worried about Chris Fay putting words in his mouth. The police bugged David's home.
It weren't just a bug, it were a camera, it were proper recording surveillance and everything, and they brought a team down from London, and they filmed my house for about 2 months, a long time.
Panorama understands the police did investigate Chris Fay for a possible attempt to pervert the course of justice over David's claims. The Met says it won't comment. David admits he finds it a struggle to recall details, and I'd certainly found it difficult to get a clear and consistent picture from him. In the past, he's been willing to tell people what they want to hear, and it's possible that he may be doing that to us too.
Thanks, Nick, for joining us here at Exero today.
Yet we believe it's David who Exero used to corroborate their first report of abuse at Dolphin Square, the one based on Nick's story, and which propelled the VIP paedophile ring into the headlines.
I could never be 100% sure it was Dolphin Square. Not really, no. I can only be sure about, I can only think I'm sure in my mind by people saying, yes, you were right, it is Dolphin Square. So really it came from other people, not from me. Because I never said properly from back in 1990, being honest. I've never actually said Dolphin Square.
And what about the man David identified as one of his abusers, Leon Britton?
The surname came out of Chris Fay's mouth, and I just went along with it. I identified him with a photograph, but there again, he's a well-known MP, and I might have just seen him on TV through the years and stuff, and I might have just got confused.
Chris Fay told us he never put words in David's mouth. To have done so would not have stood up to scrutiny by police or journalists. Exero say they won't comment on confidential sources, but make extensive attempts to corroborate what they say. Police interviewed David for 50 hours, but didn't pursue his case. They didn't consider Darren's evidence to be significant either. But a year ago, a new allegation was published, once again through Exero. This time, a politician would ensure police did take it seriously.
My brain had seized up and I couldn't move, and he pointed me towards the bedroom and pushed me towards the back of the flat.
The year was alleged to be 1967. The woman went by the name of Jane, and he was Leon Britton.
It was very dark there. He just lifted my dress up, I don't know, but he got on top of me and he raped me.
Alongside Exero, another familiar figure was taking on Jane's case. The MP Tom Watson, even though she wasn't one of his constituents. Police investigated, but there were problems from the start. She claimed she'd been raped in his basement flat. Leon Britton had a top-floor flat. All the people Jane said could corroborate a key part of her story contradicted it.
Even if things had happened as Jane said, a rape prosecution was unlikely to have been successful. Police thought that she hadn't been clear enough on the night that she wasn't consenting to sex.
It is up to a senior investigating officer, based on all the evidence and their experience of having reviewed the evidence in front of them, to decide whether or not to go and interview a perpetrator. I probably would want to go and speak to the suspect because they have a right to know. At the end of the day, you have to investigate that allegation.
But this time, the police decided that Leon Britton, who was terminally ill with cancer, would not be interviewed.
Do you mind not go?
Tom Watson was outraged and wrote to the Director of Public Prosecutions, suspicious about why Britton wasn't being interviewed. He said, "I am driven to the unpalatable conclusion that the identity of the alleged perpetrator, Leon Britton, may in some way have influenced treatment of the case."
For a politician to take a campaigning role on a justice issue is very common. To combine that campaigning role with an attempt to influence investigations in particular cases that have no constituency link, I think is a far riskier form of behaviour, because the consequences for the people accused of the crime can be so serious.
The consequences can be serious for police too.
Whatever they do, it will be wrong, because politicians will then be giving the police more pressure. And it needs someone at the top to say, stop, enough is enough. Stay out of policing, let them get on with their job, and stop putting pressure on cops.
After seeing Tom Watson's letter, Scotland Yard changed their mind and Leon Britton was interviewed. Norman Lamont is one of his oldest friends.
These matters, I do profoundly believe, must be investigated, but I don't think they should be reported or be assumed to be true until an irrefutable case has been made.
The Met says it is not unusual to review cases like this. But the very fact of his questioning by police finally enabled the mainstream media to name Leon Britton as a suspect in a sex abuse case.
His family, of course, saw him suffer, saw him being accused all the way right up to his death. There were press all the time outside his house while he was literally dying. I think he put all his effort in trying to get better, but alas, he didn't get better. But I'm sure it affected him. And of course, it profoundly affected his family. They were very hurt and very angry about this.
Tom Watson had got his way on the rape allegation, but his letter to the Director of Public Prosecutions didn't stop there. He demanded that the whole file of child abuse allegations against Leon Britton be reopened, including those made by David 25 years ago.
But these are allegations for which David says he now apologises.
I believe it's time that the truth came out. I believe that it's time that maybe the police could stop putting their efforts into just things that probably aren't even true, you know, in some things because it's made up just by a few people, you know, for whatever motive or whatever games they've got out of it. I feel guilty for names of people that I've never even said. If my name's been used or I've been the thing, then I'm sorry about that.
Leon Britton died in January this year. On Twitter, a former colleague, John Gummer, described the news as very sad. Tom Watson responded with one word:
Tom Watson has told Panorama that information he's given to the police has led to 3 successful prosecutions. Some victims of child abuse acknowledge MP's good intentions, but also wonder if there's more to it.
I see a lot of politicians stepping forward for these massive exclusives where it's all about the establishment. Do I think that they're inherently bad or dishonest people? No, I don't. Do I think that, that some people have used us as a step politically upwards? Yes, I do.
Since Savile, there's no doubt that things have changed. Victims of abuse are now being properly listened to.
The last government have set up the UK's biggest ever public inquiry into this subject area. So I think they have recognised that there is a very serious issue here that we need to get to grips with. The thousands of people that have come forward already and will come forward in the future cannot all be making it up.
But what if some of them are making it up? How do we look after the rights of the accused?
We have to be very careful that the increasing respect that we've accorded to victims doesn't bring in its wake a decreasing respect for the rights of accused people. And I think that's one of the risks, and I think we've been seeing that.
And if the most high-profile police investigation of all, Operation Midland, were to conclude it's not true that men in powerful positions tortured, abused and murdered, what then?
What we've got at the moment is a reaction to the failure to investigate people like Jimmy Savile. And I fear what we may get is a reversion to that, saying it's all been a waste of time and enormous sums of money have been spent on it. We're going to scale it all down and pursue other things. And that means that some genuine victims probably will go uninvestigated and not get any sort of justice.
There's no more highly charged question in this country than how the police, politicians and the press have dealt with child abuse. Institutions that now realise they made terrible mistakes. Are they in danger of using victims in the rush to make amends?
I think that everybody involved in this process has to be responsible for their actions. You know, this is not for public show. We're not a commodity, you know? Survivors are not a commodity for people's careers, people's bank accounts, whether it be politicians, whether it be the media, whether it be the police. We're not a PR stunt for people. And that's what really needs to be made clear.
The truth about the VIP paedophile ring may take its time to emerge. But for both victims of abuse and those who are accused, how we get to the truth has become nearly as important as the truth itself.
For details of organisations which offer advice and support, go online to bbc.co.uk/actionline or call the BBC Action Line to hear recorded information on 0800 077 077. Lines are open 24 hours and are free from landlines and mobiles.